Well, thank you for those songs of worship. I'd like to greet you this morning like I imagine the Apostle Peter would. Good morning, brothers and sisters at Turkey Run. Grace and peace to you in Jesus Christ our Lord. Doesn't that sound like something Peter would start out a letter with this morning? And this morning I want to speak to you from the book of 1 Peter. And you'll notice our text is just 2 verses. What got me thinking about this probably a month or so ago, I was thinking, as leaders in a church, I think one of the jobs that they have is to sort of warn the people, give the people insight about what's happening in the world and what's our options, I'll say. And I feel very uncomfortable doing that. But I think leaders in the past have done that, and so I'm going to take a stab at that this morning. In preparation for this message this week, every day, I read the book of 1 Peter in a different translation. And then as I read every day, I would try to see what sprung out at me out of this book. What's here? What's a couple of major ideas or points that he's making. And I came up with 4. First of all, the resurrection of Jesus Christ makes all the difference in the world. That's how he starts the book out, actually, the first half of the first chapter, talking about the resurrection, the life and death of Jesus Christ. Makes all the difference. It's our hope of ultimate victory. A new heaven and a new earth. The second one is that we are called to be holy. And sometimes people get the idea of the verse or the term holy. We think of it in like you're some really good person. Like, if I do something really compassionate or something, oh, you're such a holy person. Not quite. That's not quite the meaning. The actual meaning of holy is it's a relational term. We are called to be holy as Christ or God is holy. It becomes our identity. It's like the term we use for marriage, holy matrimony. So in that sense, I'm a holy person. I am a part of holy matrimony. And one of the main things that makes me holy in that is when I made my vows to Bethany, I said, I am going to be yours and only yours till I die. That's holiness. That's holiness. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, but in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. That's holiness, you guys. We're called to be holy. Number 3, in the book of 1 Peter, I noticed the importance of relationships. The last half of the book basically is about our interaction relationally with different people and groups. The fourth one is that suffering is just a normal part of Christian living. It just is. So with those 4 points looking at me, I thought, well, what now do I have to say to this congregation today? The book of 1 Peter was written, I think, and your Bible might say different things, but it was around the early part or to mid 60s AD. Whenever it was written, about a year and a half after that, Peter was dead, martyred. And so that gives Peter had something to say here. He wasn't just talking. He realized that the church was about to enter a time of persecution that they hadn't known before. Thus, he wrote the book. Now, in that context, like if I knew that tomorrow morning, Turkey, Iran believers were going to face persecution like never before. You're going to have knocks on your door. You're going to be drugged out. You're going to go to prison. What would I say to you today? Would I say, think about the resurrection. Don't forget to be holy. Don't forget to really have good marriages. Obey the government. And just remember, suffering is a normal part of Christian living. That's what Peter said, basically, to these people in that context. I'm going to do something this morning that I don't like to do a whole lot, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a book review. This book was written over 50 years ago. Some of you will recognize the author's name, Francis Schaeffer. He was a Reformed theologian back in the 60s and 70s. The book that I'm going to share from a little bit was entitled The Church at the End of the 20th Century. The copyright on this book is 1970, the year I graduated from high school, by the way. And so a few years after that, I would have bought this book. Well, now we are 22 years into the 21st century, and I want you to listen carefully as I give a little bit of a concise review of this book and see what you think in light of what I just said about 1 Peter. I'm going to give a couple of quotes, and I quote here from Francis Schaeffer, 1970. I believe the church today is in real danger. It is in for a rough time. We are facing present pressures and future manipulations which will be overwhelming. Society is going to change. The historic Christian faith of the Reformation is in the minority. Now, he's a Reformed theologian. He's not an Anabaptist. So don't think I'm giving that bent here necessarily. Most Christians go on as if we are in the majority, as though the status quo belongs to us. It does not. One of the greatest injustices we do to our young people is to ask them to be conservatives. Christianity today is not conservative, but revolutionary. Conservatism means standing in the flow of the status quo, and that no longer belongs to us. Today, we are an absolute minority. Now, this is really interesting to me. Francis Schaeffer, being a Reformed theologian, Reformed person, he views the church and the government of society really close, like they can affect each other. Francis Schaeffer, in his church, as John Calvin, they would have the flags, as many churches do today, the American flag and the Christian flag. But here Francis Schaeffer asks this question, and I ask you. Now, we don't have that because we don't have the flag. But what would it take in your Christian life, and in light of what we see is happening in our culture, to remove the flag? Now, again, I say to most of us, that's not a big deal because we don't come from that, but some of us do. And that would be huge. And it's interesting for Mr. Schaeffer to ask that question. Because he goes on and he says, equating any other loyalty with another loyalty, Equating any other loyalty with our loyalty to God is sin. He makes that statement. Quickly, a couple of points that he then makes. 1, the notion of a government and a law based on God's character and His revelation in Scripture is no longer operative in our world, in our country. Now, he's making that a little bit over 50 years ago. He's making that statement. Number 2, there is a loss of truth. Truths are no longer absolute in our culture. Truth of that which accurately represents what is real for all. Truth is what actually represents what is real for all time and all places, no longer exists. Modern man thinks truth is unfindable. Even in our scientific world, everything becomes averages and relevant. 3, the demise of natural leadership. The loss of respect for leaders, and we see that in our country. What is the level of respect for our president, for Congress, for any, just law enforcement in general? The loss of respect for leaders, and you see that in churches, in the church world also. Sheep without shepherds. Number 4, the loss of personal responsibility. How often have you heard someone say, even jokingly, it's not my job, not my responsibility. I just work here 9 to 5. The sense of entitlement, the loss of looking out for each other, the breakdown of families and communities. Number 5, the whole thing of population growth and shift, racism, terrorism, and all that sort of thing. And then the last one he gives is genetics. And again, this is over 50 years ago, so but we hear about GMOs, genetically modified plants and things. I think that might be the least of our worries right now. He makes the point, and I don't know where this is scientifically, but he asks the question, who's going to make the babies? And I think what he was referring to was test tube babies, which I don't know where that is now, because he saw that as coming down the pike, and genetically we could engineer people as to what we really wanted them to be. And maybe that's there. I'm not up to speed on that. But interesting, listen to this. In fact, if that happened, we could, we get too many males or too many females, we could delete these and all that kind of stuff. Who gets treated for what? And not only will the sick people get treated, the healthy people will get treated also. And we are on the verge, this is a quote, we are on the verge of being able to make new deadly viruses for which there are no cure as super weapons. Isn't that crazy? Okay, that's the end of the book review. Let's come to our text. First Peter 2:11 and 12. These two verses are looked at as Bible students as kind of the middle of the book as far as what Peter wants to say. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. I don't know what terms your particular translation might use to identify us as Christians. My various translations use terms as aliens, exiles, sojourners, refugees, foreigners, strangers, and pilgrims. Verse 11. Verse 11 is a negative verse. Verse 12, we want to look at it as a positive verse. How do we live and survive in this hostile environment in which Francis Schaeffer just described over 50 years ago? Peter begins by calling us, his audience, dearly beloved. And he uses the word agape there for God's love. And it's in the plural, the church. Dearly beloved. All of us, all of you. I beseech you, I think the King James uses. That's a pleading term. He implores us. I beseech you, you God-loved people, as strangers and pilgrims. I don't know if you felt, as I was going through Francis Schaeffer's list of stuff, I was hoping that it would make you start feeling a little bit like a stranger and a pilgrim in this world. Because that's who Peter says we are. That's our identity. A couple of months ago, I got word that a supervisor that I had worked for in the post office had died. It surprised me. He was only in his early 50s. And I had gotten to know him a little bit because in my job every year a supervisor had to ride with us on the route to do a route inspection. So I had spent, I think, 2 days with this guy, this supervisor on the route, and I had some really good talks with him. He wasn't a Christian. He died, I think 53 years old. Anyway, I was invited to the memorial service. You know where it was? It was at AmVets in Lancaster. And the invitation that came to me said, it's going to be at AmVets. Come and have a cold one on Eric. I felt like a stranger and a pilgrim there. I went, very sad. But it's things like that you get in that you help us realize we're strangers and we're pilgrims, literally. And I want you to sense that. Peter wants you to sense that. And then he says, abstain. Live with a certain detachment from this life. Don't get so settled in. Have some sort of restraints of something. Here's a good Anabaptist term. Be non-conformed. In fact, that's a good Paul term, isn't it? Don't conform any longer to the ways of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's so easily to settle in, to compromise, and to think this is normal. You all know a couple of weeks ago, Bethany and I took a trip. We took about 2 weeks, and I'm telling you, we bought a lot of gas. And we would watch the prices, and they would go up and down a little bit depending, but we we were out in the middle of nowhere, like you get out there, and we needed gas. So I pulled in, and you know how much it cost? $4.39. We had never paid that much on this trip when we thought. And Bethany said, well, just get a little bit and get us to the next one. But you know what the price of gas was in Bremen when we came back through? I think we need to go back to Colorado and get the $4.39. You sort of get used to it, don't you? $3.99 sounds pretty good now. Listen, you guys, that is how the world can work us. We can get used to things pretty easily. And it blinds us to the eternal. And I think that's what Peter's warning us of here. Society hammers at us compulsively. And then Peter talks about the evil desires that it stirs up. The term there really is the psychic. He's not talking so much about the deeds, he's talking about our minds. The desires, that which conjures up in our minds as the world comes at us. Perverts our thinking, makes us believe lies, which lead to wrong conclusions and then wrong behavior. And he uses a very strong word for this action. He calls it war. Now, I have never been to war, to combat, but I've read a lot about it. And I can imagine how terrible, how horrible, how destructive, how intense. You can't overstate it. But that's what we're in, you guys. We're in a war, he's saying. Peter's warning us. And in this war, the things that ultimately get broken are relationships. I'd like to go to the second verse, verse 12 now. And this is a positive one. Live good lives among the pagans. He's describing the two groups. From sinful desires to good deeds. Romans 12:21, overcome evil with good. The German theologian Karl Barth, which we wouldn't agree with totally, translates this, overcome evil with Christian service, mercy, and forgiveness. Live with a consistency and integrity of life. I want to make a point here about doing our good deeds before the pagans. Peter is calling us to do good deeds that the pagans see as good and causes them to glorify God. Again, I'm going to do something I don't like to do, but I don't know how many of you are aware, but there is a group of people, of Anabaptists, that are called black bumpers. You've heard of them? They do it as a thing of piety. They're conservative, I'll just say Mennonites. But they paint their bumpers black on their cars, the chrome, as a thing of piety. And God bless them. And they're painting. But do you think if we would all paint our bumpers black, that the pagans would glorify God? Probably not. I don't think that's what Peter's talking about here. But listen, you guys, what do you and I do that perhaps are acts of piety and we think that only glorify us and not God? Think about what would glorify God in my life before the pagans. I think what would glorify God before the pagans is the character and virtue of God Himself through us. Again, Peter comes and he says, in these things, the way that happens is, again, it's relational. That just spoke to me so much out of 1 Peter, the last part. Here Peter is talking to these people that are going to face intense persecution, and he's telling them to have good marriages, listen to the elders, obey the government, and suffer. So it's relational. It's what we need to really protect and live out. Actually, Jesus pretty much said the same thing in John 13:34. A new commandment I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, the pagans will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Pretty clear. And Peter even goes on to say that the end of all things is near. Therefore be clear-minded and self-controlled so you can pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to each other. Mike alluded to that. Without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift he has received to serve others. And that's Peter's word to us today in the world we live. Now, quickly, I would like to give, there's a couple of structures here. There's defensive structures in living out this, and there's offensive structures. Quickly. And this, I'm going to give these to you really fast and see what makes you think, what it makes you think of. Number one, there's 4 of these in the defensive structure of a group in the evil world in which we live. First of all, strong leadership. Second one, protect marriage. Only marry within the group. And that doesn't mean like we just have to marry people in Turkey, Iran, but in the faith. Marry only people in the faith. Third one, cultivate cultural identity symbols. As people look at us, what do they see as, oh, that's who, like, if people would look at Turkey, Iran, what are we known for? What are we developing here that people can look at us and, oh, that's Turkey, Iran. And then the fourth one is educate your youth. Actually, those are sociological truths of any group that wants to maintain its existence. Good leaders protect marriage and home, cultivate something that identifies you culturally about who you are, and educate your youth. What are the truth of what you're passing on? To me, I just saw the Amish right off the bat. They do that very strong. And we can criticize them, blah, blah, and go on and do that and say whatever. But listen, you guys, those 4 points, Peter is showing us that we need to live them out in some way to be God's people. We call those defensive structures. We set up our lives in that way that we can live out what we believe God to live. And we will suffer for that at some points. The offensive structure. First of all, it is possible to know truth. We can go out into the world believing that we have the truth. Now, we might not have it exhaustively. We don't. But we have the truth. And that is not a defensive, that's an offensive truth, an exercise that we're to carry out. We have the truth, you guys. It's in Jesus Christ, in His Word. The second thing is from Peter, we have to have, and this is not my term, but it's a good term. We have to have and practice an orthodox community. That means a very set community. We have to have people that are committed to the community. That's one of the greatest, I'll tell you this. I was reading in a preacher magazine recently, one of the greatest stresses of a pastor today is having congregations of uncommitted people. You don't know who you can count on. People come, go, whatever. That's what this term means, to an orthodox community. We are a people dedicated to each other, to this group, for the long haul, through thick and thin. And when we have that, that speaks to the world. It's an observable love, as Jesus said. And then I think, and this will be my last point, I think that we need to take those 4 points that I had mentioned earlier: leadership, marriage and home, cultural identity, and make sure our youth understand what we're about and are taught. We need to keep renewing those. We need, the life of the church needs to keep renewing those things. Keep them alive. Not become conservative, just trying to hold. No, you keep those things alive and working and thinking and interacting. I have 2 verses yet to share with you, and then I'm done. Luke 21:28. When these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Let me draw you a picture. Here is a herd of cattle just laying down. They're very content. Everybody's laying down. Their bellies are full of grass. They're quiet. All of a sudden, and this is true in most herds, all of a sudden you see this head pop up of one cow. And it's like this. It's on alert. And pretty soon it gets up. And everybody else is just quiet. But all of a sudden, another cow notices it, and its head goes up. And it jumps up. And pretty soon they're all up looking at whatever is threatening them. That is the description of this verse, you guys. Think of it as a congregation. You're all sitting here, your heads are up, most of you. But when these things take place, somebody has to pop up first. They notice something. And in fact, this literal verse, if you would read it literally, it would be when these things take place, one by one, 2 by 2, stand up and lift your heads toward whatever's happening. And pretty soon over time, the whole group is doing that. That's what that verse means, you guys. But I think to get there, we need to do whatever the things I said previously and that Mr. Schaefer warned us of. Stand up. Heads up, we're on alert. Philippians 4:6. The Lord is near. There's a lot of mornings I wake up quoting this verse, and I want you also to do that. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Isn't that a comforting verse? And so true.